really glad to see everyone. Good afternoon. Great to be with you. Thanks so much for taking the time to be a part of today's exchange. As we get started, if you haven't already, please feel free to jump over into the chat box and say a quick hello, your name, your affiliation, where you're joining us from, and any updates you'd like to share with this community as we continue to learn and evolve our work together. Also, just wanted to let you know that we're in webinar format today. You probably noticed that. So we've got a couple of different features we want to highlight. We're going to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen to engage in conversation. That's also a great place to let us know if you're experiencing any technical issues. And then we'll use the Q&A feature, a separate button at the bottom of your screen to raise questions with our speakers. So anytime you have a question throughout, it doesn't have to wait until the end of any of the sessions of today's agenda. Please go ahead and jump down into that Q&A box. And finally, don't forget to have a good time. Just because we're on screen and not together doesn't mean we can't enjoy the time that we have together today. Quick note too, that we are recording today's webinar. So if you didn't see the little flashing red button up in the upper left-hand corner, please note that, and just want to be able to record these so that we can share the contents in our conversation with people who are not able to carve this time out of their agenda. If I haven't met you yet, hello. My name is Sean Johnson. I'm with the University of Montana. And in addition to serving as facilitator for conversations like this, I serve in a leadership role with the California Landscape Stewardship Network. And I'm glad to have helped facilitate these conversations over the past several years. For those of you that are still becoming familiar with the network, it's a forum for landscape stewardship practitioners across the state to discuss shared challenges, common issues, and shared hopes for the future. The California Network website is an additional resource for information on the history, evolution, and focus areas of the network. And Devin, if you wouldn't mind just sharing that link in the chat so that people who are interested to learn more can. In the case of cutting green tape, the network's role has been really to help catalyze and advance the conversation. So working in partnership with all of you to offer opportunities to convene conversations, to discuss complex issues, and to provide a starting point, not just for identifying common issues, but for creating an implementation roadmap that we've been discussing over the last couple of exchanges. Really want to just recognize and honor all the work that's come before us and many of the past efforts that have led up to today's exchange, as well as our excitement about the many conversations ahead. Next, just a quick overview of today's conversation. So turning to today's Cutting Green Tape exchange, I want to take a minute to just set the stage. First of all, thanks for all your past engagement. We wouldn't be here today without your active involvement, engagement, and feedback. And so we really have worked hard to integrate your thoughts and your feedback into today's program. It has been shaped based on that feedback, and really want to just take a minute here to provide that overview and outline. So we'll start, as we've done in the past, by taking a quick poll using Poll Everywhere, getting to know who's in the room and who's been able to join us today. We'll then hear some quick reflections from Secretary Wade Crowfoot, and then we'll be looking at CDFW's efforts to develop a cutting green tape program. We'll then move forward with a few updates from last fall's lightning exchange topics. That was a really fun part of our exchange last fall, and we've got a couple of updates and additions to share. Then we've got a new segment of the agenda that we're excited. It's going to be a series of vignettes to share, first on cutting green tape around the state, which is really focused on interagency collaboration and how it's helping advance the conversation around cutting green tape. And then next slide, Devin, going to keep going into the next hour with a focus on Indigenous stewardship and its connection point to cutting green tape efforts in a couple of different instances. And both of those are really highlighting some of these emerging and exciting stories around how cutting green tape is really shaping conversations and places throughout the state. We've got a new award that we're excited to unveil during today's conversation and exchange. So at 4:45, we'll be presenting the inaugural Hidden Hero Awards. And then we've got some parting thoughts and next steps to round out our day. Before, I think next we're going to just get a better sense of who's in the room. So what we want to do next is jump over to your chat box again, again, there's going to be a link to a Poll Everywhere link. So for those of you that have been with us in the past, we use Poll Everywhere as an online tool to really help gain immediate feedback from all of you in a really quick way. And so there's a link to a Poll Everywhere survey that Devin just dropped into the chat box there. If you click on that, it should take you to a series of 3 questions. So as soon as the first one pops up on your screen, go ahead and jump in and answer it. The first one really is just a sense of where you're joining us from today. Looks like few people like myself from outside the state, but almost everyone, they're up and down the coast. A lot of people there from Central California, Northern California. Wonderful to see so many people that they're in the capital region, especially, that were able to join us. So thank you so much for taking the time to be here. Let's go ahead and move to our next question, which is really just trying to get a sense of how many of these conversations you've been involved in. So it looks like some of you are joining us for the first time, or maybe this is your second one. Others have been with us for a series of conversations. So whether you're returning or really continuing with us on this journey, we really are joining us for the first time or continuing with us on this journey. We really appreciate the time that you've been that you've carved out to be with us today. So thank you so much. Looks like those are settling in now. So let's go to the last question. It's really just focused on getting a sense of who's in the room. All right, so this one's all about your affiliation, whether you're with an agency, a nonprofit partner, tribal government, academic institution, foundation, maybe you're a consultant, maybe none of those labels fit. So lots of folks from our government agencies and nonprofit partners, a few tribal government representatives, a couple of consultants, and a few other. Wonderful. Well, again, we're so glad you're here, that you're part of the conversation, and just hope to keep you engaged throughout this conversation and beyond. Do want to just recognize that these exchanges do feel like we have limited time together. And we know that, we understand that. And so what we're trying to do in today's program, and as these exchanges continue to unfold, is think about the conversations as a high-level introduction to a variety of topics. And those are topics that we hope to explore with you in more depth, well beyond the 2 hours that we have together. So really just touching the surface of some of these really important topics that we really think are foundational, that respond to some of your interests and issues that you've raised, and that set the stage for ongoing conversation. And just on that note, before we jump into the actual content, want to share what we've heard from you in some of those past exchanges and the follow-up surveys that you filled out afterward. First, just that you appreciate and understand and see that there's so much good work happening across the state, and that one of the ways we want to use these exchanges is to bring that forward. We've seen such a diversity of effective innovation and other work happening with you online through Cutting Green Tape and in other forums. And some of you have mentioned how this work that we've done in these conversations, or the work and the conversations we've had, has really led to support of on-the-ground work with a variety of efforts, including invasive plant species management, delta ecosystem restoration, and through regulatory streamlining like the CEQA exemption. The second thing is that there's certainly no shortage of good ideas about how to take the conversation further. And so you've mentioned things like using more programmatic decisions or authorizations so that similar projects can advance more quickly and cost effectively. The idea that we need to integrate workforce issues to help connect communities to restoration and to advance work on the ground, that we need to continue supporting agency and regulatory staff in advancing the work, and also just making sure that folks both inside and outside of agencies are able to collaborate and innovate within their purview. Finally, we heard from the survey responses that many of you are feeling good about these exchanges, but that we need to continue fostering an ongoing learning space for Cutting Green Tape. And so that's one of the things we're going to look at moving forward. So thank you all for all this valuable feedback and guidance. We'll be looking for additional ways to continue to develop Cutting Green Tape and to collaborate with all of you. All right, I think we've done all the stage setting we need to for today. So excited to kick off the content for today with remarks from Wade Crowfoot, Secretary of Natural Resources for the state of California. As Secretary, he oversees 19,000 people charged with protecting and managing California's diverse resources. His visionary leadership has been the catalytic ingredient behind not just cutting green tape, but also the agency's work in biodiversity, inclusive access, and more. So had the honor of introducing Secretary Crowfoot based on his formal role on a number of occasions now, and it's starting to feel a bit impersonal. So I thought I might just add from my own perspective, I see Secretary Crowfoot as a person who really exemplifies the qualities of leadership that are needed at this time of extraordinary change and possibility. He's empathetic, understanding, he has vision and care, and he trusts that all of us can come together to do bold, important things together. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Wade, and thanks for joining us today.
Hey, thank you, Sean. And we definitely know each other enough that you don't have to give me the canned secretary introduction. It's really Wade. And huge thanks to everybody for joining today. And more importantly, thanks for being the driving force of this Cutting the Green Tape initiative. I'm really energized. It's been an impactful week for me. Yesterday, me and my team were down in the Coachella Valley. We did a bunch of different things down there, but one thing we did is meet with our Coachella Valley Mountains Conservancy and some of its key partners, including the Wildlands Conservancy and the Native American Lands Conservancy and a bunch of others. Just here, we were meeting in a beautiful preserve, if you're down that way around Palm Springs, Desert Hot Springs, called Whitewater Preserve. And it was beautiful. And we just had a chance to connect and talk about how the state can support the conservation and restoration work happening on the ground. And I always leave those discussions really energized because it's the people on the ground, whether they're in a state or federal agency or from a nonprofit or community group, that are actually getting the work done. And I consider our job, 24 floors up in a building in Sacramento, all about providing you the empowerment, the resources, the support to get the job done. And then this morning, I started my day off at a meeting of the California Truth and Healing Council, which is led by Native American leaders, all focused on acknowledging and redressing really the dark chapters of California state history in its relationship with tribal communities and governments. And while that was a challenging discussion, it was an important one. And so between yesterday's discussion, today's discussion that I just mentioned, we're really, in my mind, engaged in transformational discussions and transformational work. And that's really what I consider the CGT, or Cutting Green Tape, to be all about. It was almost 3 years ago when a few people, including Sharon and Kellax, and then Armando Quintero, before he was State Parks Director, came into my office at the Resources Agency and said, hey, look, we're this coalition of the willing, the Landscape Stewardship Network, and we've got a bunch of big ideas, but we can't get our work done quickly enough because of some institutional barriers that really shouldn't exist. And that was really the seed that was planted that grew into this Cutting the Green Tape initiative. And since then, I'm deeply thankful for the Landscape Stewardship Network and colleagues throughout our agency, but certainly Cal EPA and the State Water Board, Food and Agriculture, federal agencies, for actually taking this up and joining this effort to really identify how do we more quickly and more effectively deliver habitat restoration and stewardship. We know why we're here, and that is we all think California is an incredible place, obviously culturally, economically, but naturally. We are one of the biodiversity hotspots in the world. We have more landscapes than almost any conceivable place on Earth. We have a richness of plants and animals and other life that is almost without compare. But we also know that richness, that nature, is under severe threat. Since we were together last in person, certainly over the last 2 years, another report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has been released that shows us we have a small and narrowing window of time to do what we need to do to avoid the worst of catastrophic of climate change. That same report, interestingly, elevated the role of restoring in caring for nature as a key component in addressing climate change, both on the mitigation side and building climate resilience. We know our biodiversity, which is part of our identity here in California, is under threat. Remarkable New York Times article just last month with some great mapping showed the heat map of biodiversity across the country and demonstrates that California is not only the most biodiverse part of the country, but it's also the place where biodiversity is most under stress because of climate change and development and so much more. Every week in, week out, we see it. We see our fish imperiled because of the second debilitating drought in just a decade of time. We see large mammals coming out of the wilderness into places like Tahoe with the black bears, or Palm Springs, where I was yesterday, where the city mayor pro tem explained to me that the bighorn sheep are coming out of the mountains like they never have before because of the lack of water. So we know our nature is in crisis. And the question is, what are we going to do about it? What we're going to do about it is we're going to do what we need to more quickly, cost effectively, and ultimately effectively. In other words, restoring our nature, protecting our nature, stewarding our nature at greater scale and doing it more quickly. And that's what cutting the green tape is all about. We have now billions of dollars that we are going to be spending in coming years across California. And so we have a real opportunity to make more headway than we have in decades, restoring our nature, our natural landscapes, our waterways. And we know we need to improve our processes and unleash creativity and innovation in the field to actually get this work done more quickly. I'm a big believer that cutting the green tape is about rule changes and it's about regulatory reform. But fundamentally, to me, it's about empowering the people that are closest to the projects, both on the regulatory side and on the project delivery side, to really understand what's needed to ensure the project is effective. You're avoiding unintended consequences, but you're creating a pathway to get this good work done. So I'm both passionate about the work that we're doing and energized by the progress that you all are making. This week, we released an update, thanks to my colleague, Jen Norris, who's zooming in a few offices down the hall. She really spearheaded an update to a letter that I wrote our staff over a year ago to identify actions we needed to take across CNRA and its entities to cut the green tape. So we have an update that we're sharing. It's a short, focused update, and it details all of this work that's happening across our state conservancies, certainly Fish and Wildlife that you'll hear about, Department of Water Resources, state parks. I mean, it's incredible. Really, I would say the broad array of entities across our agency have taken this mantle and run with it. I talk about sort of 4 areas of progress in this update. One is improvements of permitting and regulatory processes, improving the use of the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA, including an unprecedented exemption that is time limited until 2025 for restoration work that is really simply focused on restoration. And our colleague Chuck Bonham and Fish and Wildlife actually certifying what projects qualify for that exemption, actually now being utilized for the first time up in the Garcia River, I believe, on the North Coast. The third area is simplifying grants and loan programs to more quickly and cost effectively deliver the projects. And then fourth is enhancing this communication, coordination, and collaboration. So do take a look at that. We'll put that in the chat, and just put that in your browser and save it for later. And that'll detail the progress we think we're making across the agency. I'm so appreciative for the work that gets done, and I'm really excited that later in this meeting, our Cutting Green Tape Exchange is going to kick off what we hope is a tradition, which is identifying hidden heroes. In other words, those folks that are getting this work done and making transformational change, but might not get the visibility or credit of somebody in my position. So we really want to lift up all the good work happening across our state agencies and our non-state government partners. Lastly, I would just say Godspeed. There's no time to waste. We have done a lot. We should feel like we're, making progress, but we have a lot of work to do. I think about that sort of a metaphor of a rocket, and that rocket, when it's taking off, it gets, that fuel burns and you see that amazing flame, but the rocket doesn't take off. And then finally it starts to take off. And then when it obviously gains momentum, it's off into the atmosphere. I feel like we've taken off. I don't feel like we've reached our cruising altitude, certainly in outer space. And I want to go to Mars. That's a little strange of a metaphor. So let me put it this way. It's almost like you are putting a habitat restoration project in. You do the planning and the permitting. You're starting to get have that sort of ground moving, and you're starting to see the ecological function, but it's not all the way there. So I feel like we're in a good place, but there's so much further we can go. Last point, law of inertia, at least as I understand it. A body at rest tends to stay at rest. A body in motion tends to stay in motion. We've got that motion. We've got that momentum. Let's keep it up and let's move further and faster. Thanks so much for the opportunity to share my thoughts, and back to you, Sean.
Great. Thank you so much, Secretary Crowfoot. Really appreciate your words as always. I love that simplification in your mind of saying that fundamentally this is about empowering the people who are closest to the projects, right? And really helping them see and hold the power that they have to affect change over time. And then, yeah, whether the analogy worked or not, the point was very clear, right? That we have a long way to go, and we really want this to be something that can be transformative, that meets the urgency of today, and that really does equip us to have the landscape and the community that we want for tomorrow across California, and hopefully as an example for the rest of the country, honestly. Got a little distracted there simply because Jen Norris dropped that chat or that link into the chat, and I started reading right away. So much happening in that report. So thanks, Jen, for dropping that into the chat. And speaking of Jen, I'm going to turn to her next. We're going to hear a little bit more about CDFW's Cutting Green Tape program, and I'm glad to have Jen Norris here to help set the stage for the conversation. For those of you who haven't yet met Jen, she joined the California Natural Resources Agency back in June of 2020, and as Deputy Secretary for Biodiversity and Habitat, she's responsible for overseeing the statewide biodiversity strategy, including the California Biodiversity Collaborative. Her leadership of Cutting Green Tape is integral in supporting all stakeholders who are interested in coming together to advance landscape scale habitat restoration. And Jen, good to see you again. Thanks so much for helping lead this conversation about CDFW's work today.
Thank you, Sean. And man, I love that picture of Brad. I want a picture of myself with a giant scissor and green tape. I have the pleasure of introducing Brad. Secretary Crowfoot said all the most important things about why we're here and the important work we need to do together. But I'm really excited that we're going to hear from Brad because we can make all the regulatory changes we want. We can set up all the processes we want. But at the end of the day, you got to have the right people in the right places to work together in partnership. And what I know about Brad is he is the right guy. He has just set up Department of Fish and Wildlife's brand new Cutting Green Tape program. I understand he's hiring people and setting the stage to really accelerate our work. But everybody that I know so far that has worked with Brad in this space is just incredibly effusive about his willingness to partner, sit down, problem solve. He's really an inspiration to all of us. And I'm really excited that he's here to talk to us about his new team, what they're doing, improvements to their grant procedures, new restoration permitting tools, and of course, a new CEQA statutory exemption. Brad's been with CDFW for 20 years, but I feel like he's a fresh new face in this space, and I'm really glad to introduce him. Brad, what you got?
Oh, gee, you're going to make me cry. Thank you so much. Thanks so much. What a pleasure it is to be here today. This is my very first exchange. And so in reflecting on that fact, I thought I might start out by just sharing a few random facts about myself. I grew up in southwestern Los Angeles County, and I spent much of my youth exploring the local open space, which we didn't have a whole lot of real nearby, the Palos Verdes Peninsula, the Santa Monica Mountains, and the Angeles National Forest. I was the vice president of my high school backpacking club, which is kind of also wins you some sort of a nerd award, I think. I switched majors in college a few times. I went from business to geology and finally settled on botany. And also during my college years, about 1991, I bought a book, and the title of the book was Helping Nature Heal: An Introduction to Environmental Restoration, which also happened to be a miniature version of the Whole Earth catalog, if anyone knows what that is. This little book tells stories about ecological restoration projects happening around the world when even that being a thing, ecological restoration, was new to many of us. And I thought to myself at that point, can humans really help nature to heal? How could that even be real? And I was completely intrigued. And so as I moved from college into my first post-college job with the Forest Service as a botanist, I was almost immediately given an opportunity to start working on restoration. I worked on abandoned mine restoration. I helped rehabilitate unauthorized roads or old roads. We went out and collected native seed. We grew the plants. We planted them in the ground and hoped they would make it. We had a greenhouse. We had a volunteer corps. And I became a practitioner pretty early in my career. And really my only skills up to that point were a degree in botany and some experience gardening. In my next job, post-Forest Service, I worked as an environmental consultant, and I managed restoration projects that were mitigation projects, projects that were required by agency permits for development. And I learned some of the ropes there as well. And as already mentioned, over the last 20 years, I've been working for the California Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've kind of jumped around. I've worked in 3 different regions, covering our coasts, our deserts, the Sierra Nevada, the North State, the Southland, where I'm from, and I've worked in our wildlife program, our fisheries program, our habitat conservation program as well. So restoration has been a constant theme throughout my career. And I became the first CDFW Cutting the Green Tape program manager in November 2021, so about 4.5 months now. And yes, we put the in our name, but now I find myself saying cutting green tape all the time. So what is CDFW's version or vision for cutting green tape? Our program is housed within the Watershed Restoration Grants Branch. And so this is a new home for a program that focuses in part on environmental permitting. I have 3 direct staff. I have an analyst and 2 scientists, plus incredible support from CDFW leadership. In addition to my immediate staff, we have 9 additional strike team members being hired out in the CDFW regions. And when we use the term strike team, to me, that brings up thoughts of that, how that term is used in the world of firefighting. And I live in the wildland, urban interface. And if I see a fire up on the next ridge, I want the strike team, to be knocking on my door. And so I hope we can fulfill that role in the overall effort of accelerating restoration. So we have 9 of these strike team members. They're distributed out in the regions. We're very close to being through with hiring. We have just 4 more to bring on board. We have also a dedicated attorney to help develop new permitting tools, because obviously they have to comply with existing law and all that. Our statewide strike team meets every single week to share information, to learn. We have a lot of young and eager and passionate folks, as well as a few veterans like myself. The common thread is that we're all very, very committed to advancing restoration. So it's a fantastic group. We're just getting started, but I'm really inspired by being able to work with them. And by the way, we're always looking for guest speakers. And I know there are lots of people here in the exchange participating today who might be wonderful guest speakers, so that we can continue to learn and be exposed to new perspectives. So as part of the larger goals of cutting green tape, our branch, the Watershed Restoration Grants Branch, has made quite a few significant improvements to our restoration and granting procedures. And I'll give you just a few examples. The first is that grant agreement and amendment timelines have been reduced by as much as about 40%. Agreements now are executed internally within the branch, and this allows projects to move forward much more quickly. If you're waiting for a grant agreement to be signed and your start date is June 15th, right around late spring, you start to really begin to worry about whether or not you can start your project. So this has been a really significant improvement. Another new feature is having a new contingency funding process, which is now available. And this allows a mechanism for supplementing funding when a project is faced with unanticipated costs. And we know that things happen all the time. We're painfully aware of that over the last few years of wildfires, COVID, and everything else, the price of materials, the price of fuel. Costs are really difficult to manage. And so this is something that we're really excited about too. And the last example I'll give in the granting world is that we've implemented a pre-application consultation process for grant applicants. And this allows time for one-on-one help and getting questions answered very quickly. And so we're also adopting some of those procedures in the cutting green tape permitting world as well. Just having that time to talk about things, help to find the right pathway to move it forward as efficiently as we can. And so we're also heavily focused on developing permitting and environmental review efficiencies for restoration projects. And it's really true that our traditional environmental permitting programs over time have been designed to reduce or mitigate harm, and that's a great thing, but they weren't specifically designed to advance stewardship or recovery. And so cutting the green tape is filling that gap by creating and using new tools for restoration. We're developing restoration permitting as its own distinct category. To really do a great job on the ground when you're trying to recover rare, threatened, and endangered protected species, you're often working right where these species live. And this is the first challenge that we're addressing through our new permits. Sometimes protected species are immediately in the way of heavy equipment and need to be temporarily removed from the work area, moved out of harm's way. Sometimes there could be short-term species losses that are necessary to realize long-term progress toward recovery. So our goal here is to provide practitioners with the right restoration permitting tools for these situations. So let's talk a bit about the tools. The first one I'll mention is called the Restoration Management Permit, or the RMP. And this new permit provides take authorization coverage for these protected species, both for California Endangered Species Act listed species, as well as a category of species called fully protected species. We're working on procedures that will also enable us to include common species in the restoration management permit, as well as species of special concern as well. So this would essentially be a combined permit where right now, or at least in the past, you might have had to go to different CDFW functions to get a scientific collection permit here, or a fully protected MOU here, or an incidental take permit in some other place. Well, this permit creates a central location for all of those authorizations, and the whole thing is focused on the needs of restoration projects. So although we're still working on certain pieces of this, the California Endangered Species Act and fully protected coverage is available right now for your project. And at the end of my talk, I'll mention how to get in touch with us if you think you might have a good fit. The second new tool that covers take authorizations, we're calling the Restoration Consistency Determination, or the Restoration CD. And so CDs are an existing CISA, California Endangered Species Act, take authorization pathway for species that are listed under both the Federal Endangered Species Act as well as the California Endangered Species Act. So we have reimagined this tool to now cover restoration projects very easily. Without getting into all the details, restoration CDs are very quick. They only take 30 days, and they're free of charge for voluntary restoration projects. And like the restoration management permit, it's ready for use right now as well. So both of these permits and both of the types of take that they can provide that we've talked about so far are both free. And once we fully build out the restoration management permit, if there is a fee, it's going to be really low. So on to environmental review, the new CEQA statutory exemption for restoration projects. And we always have to have acronyms for everything, right? So we're calling that SERP, S-E-R-P. And so my program is implementing the new exemption. We've been working for the last 4 months or so with lead agencies and project proponents all over the state. to fulfill our concurrence role for the new exemption, while at the same time doing everything that we can to encourage a robust stakeholder, tribal, and public agency outreach process. That's going well. We have about 20 of these in play. We have one that's working its way through final review as we speak. And every week we have at least 2 or 3 meetings with lead agencies to talk about restoration projects and can they qualify for the new exemption. So a really, really exciting new tool that came about so recently. What else are we doing? Well, we're implementing the Secretary's Cutting Green Tape memo, which Secretary Crowfoot already mentioned, and more. And I'll just quickly go through a sample of some of the things that we're doing, thinking about, planning for in the next year or so. The first is we're taking a look at our lake and streambed alteration agreement. Right now, we have a few different types of agreements, but we don't have one that's specifically targeted for restoration. And so the question is, can we create one? Is there some new type of streambed alteration agreement that might better serve the needs of restoration projects? So that's one task. Another is integrating our lake and streambed alteration agreements with our take authorizations, like the restoration management permit or a restoration CD. And can we create a single master CDFW restoration permit? One project, one permit. We've been working quite a bit over the last 4.5 months with our agency partners to explore new efficiencies. We've worked with the North Coast Regional Water Quality Control Board, the Lahontan Regional Water Quality Control Board, Redwood State Park, Redwood National Park, National Marine Fisheries Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Eco Restore, DWR, the State Water Board, and many, many others. And I'm sorry if I didn't mention you and we spoke, but there has been a lot. We're developing web resources, workshops, newsletters, and more as quickly as we can. And we regularly check in with the restoration practitioner community and ask if we're addressing their needs and priorities, and how can we do better. We also plan to work with our partners to advance all the remaining directives in the Secretary's memo this year. So yeah, let's celebrate. A lot's going on, a lot's changing really quickly. This new program is probably the most exciting thing I've ever done in my career. But let's continue to recognize, as already been mentioned, that there is still so much more work to do. So let's show some resolve and get going. And finally, our team, our strike team, myself, my staff, we're all standing by to help advance restoration projects, including your project. We have an inbox. It's restorationpermitting@wildlife.ca.gov. We usually get back to people the same day. We have 4 of us monitoring that inbox. And so please reach out and we'll see what we can do to help you. And during this, these past 4.5 months, I've spoken personally with many of you. These conversations have really inspired and energized me. I'm really, really honored to be part of this movement. So thank you very much. And we'll be talking again.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Brad. Really appreciate the introduction to you. Ton of love and appreciation in the chat coming in for you and everything that you're bringing to this new role. Also a ton of appreciation for the new tools and how important they are to accelerate restoration across the state. Given where we are in the agenda, if you wouldn't mind, Brad, answering the questions that have surfaced in the chat, just in the chat box itself. I think there was one from Abigail around the new permitting and whether or not that includes programmatic permitting for maintenance and management. Also appreciate the links that have been shared, and might also suggest that you drop that email address for the inbox in the chat too, so that people have it at their fingertips.
All right, well, let's take Abby's question. And so a couple of things there. The new restoration permits that I mentioned can help to get at that question of programmatic permitting. So the first example I'll use right now is the restoration consistency determination. We originally started exploring that because there are some programmatic biological opinions out there for restoration. In particular, the NOAA Restoration Center has several of these documents available for restoration projects within the range of anadromy. And it seems like very low-hanging fruit to see if there's some way that we could connect with those documents, utilize those documents. And so it's always been a challenge for us to do a programmatic consistency determination on a programmatic biological opinion, if for no other reason than we just don't know exactly what projects are going to come through there. But because we were given, some time, some space, and some support during our Cutting Green Tape pilot last fiscal year, we started kind of digging into that and realized that in order to have a project qualify for that program, there's an application form that's filled out, it's provided to NOAA, it's evaluated and then approved. Well, that application form actually has plenty of project-specific information. And so instead of doing a consistency determination and just looking at a programmatic document, if we look at the combination of the programmatic document, the application, and then the federal agency approval as a package. And so that's what we've done. And so that is one way that we can take advantage of existing programmatic permitting tools now. And we also have other things that I haven't mentioned that have been around, like the Habitat Restoration and Enhancement Act. And then finally, with the restoration management permit, we actually have already approved a project, which is a very, very large project. I don't know if it's, strictly speaking, you could call it a programmatic permit, but I would call it a multi-project permit. And so this is for restoration of 2 large watersheds in the North State in the Redwood Zone. It's a joint project with Redwood State National Park, along with the Save the Redwoods League. Long story short, it's about 80,000 acres of restoration, which is huge. Many, many phases, many, many sub-projects over about 30 years. And we were able to permit take of about a dozen covered species, both CECL listed and fully protected, and and do that in an 18-page permit. And so, those are some examples. I think there's still some more exploration to do on that topic as well.
Wow, that's fantastic, Brad. Thanks so much for sharing those additional examples. And obviously, you're the right guy for the job, a wealth of knowledge and a lot of good examples to point to, and really appreciate the quick update. I know it feels like we're moving forward too quickly through today's conversation, but do need to unfortunately move forward with our agenda and the next segment of it here. But if people have additional information they want to share with Brad, or just thinking about how they can be part of that process moving forward, please continue to reach out and engage beyond today's webinar. The next thing we wanted to do, just to continue to bring voices back into the room, recognizing that everything is ongoing and evolving and continuing to improve and expand, is bring back a couple of our speakers from last fall who gave lightning talks on a couple of different topics. And so we're delighted to have Madeline Cavalieri and Phil Crater back with us today. And just want to turn to them each briefly to share some updates. What's happened since we saw you last fall? What else do we need to know? How can we continue to be part of the evolution of your work and the work that we're all trying to advance together through Cutting Green Tape? And so want to first start with Madeline. And so Madeline's obviously with the California Coastal Commission. Last fall, she shared a bit of information with us on a new permitting pathway for forest projects. And I'm not sure if that's where you want to pick it up, Madeline, or if there's somewhere else you want to start, but really glad you can be back with us today.
Yeah, that's where I was going to pick it back up. Thanks so much for having me back today. I'm really excited about all the great work we're hearing about, especially at CDFW. And I'm happy to be able to report on the continuing success the Coastal Commission has had in our Cutting Green Tape efforts along the coast. The Cutting Green Tape recommendations call for the Coastal Commission to utilize efficiencies within its existing authority to advance small and large scale restoration. And Commission staff have been working towards that in a number of different ways, including by expanding on the use of programmatic permits and by adjusting and focusing our staff resources to support restoration projects. So as you mentioned, last year, the Commission developed a series of public works plans, which are essentially programmatic permits for forest restoration and wildfire resilience projects. In July, the Commission approved the first 2 plans for projects carried out in coordination with the RCDs of San Mateo and Santa Cruz County, as I talked about at our last exchange. Then in October, the Commission approved a similar plan for the Upper Salinas Las Tablas RCD in northern San Luis Obispo County. And together, these approved plans will allow for restoration projects to be carried out over a 230,000 acre area over a 10-year period without the need for additional coastal permits. So the projects can be carried out by the RCDs themselves or by other entities in coordination with the RCD. The plans were approved after over a year of interagency working group meetings. And as I mentioned in September, I think there were 3 key components to the project's success, which are also key to cutting green tape along the coast. So the first is multi-agency alignment. We were fortunate to have a foundation laid out in the Cal Vegetation Treatment Program, EIR, which had already established a great deal of alignment through the hard work of the Board of Forestry. For the coastal plan, we built on that existing framework, agreeing to use both the process and the substance of the protections that were established in the EIR. And we then continued to build agency alignment through our working group meetings. The second key component was respect and understanding for the mission and goals of each of the agencies involved, as well as the existing environmental protections that the project was subject to. One of the central issues that we had to deal with was how to ensure the Coastal Act's strict protections for sensitive habitats could be carried out in the changing climate. And I think that will be an issue that will come up across the board in all types of restoration projects. The Commission understands that we can no longer restore ecosystems only to their historic condition, and that instead we need to factor in anticipated changes and plan for a dynamic and ever-changing future condition. So ultimately with this project, we developed a streamlined set of standards that bridged the very small gap that existed between the protections established in the Cal VTP EIR and the additional protections required by the Coastal Act. And this model of relying on existing project protections as much as possible and focusing our limited staff resources on any gaps that may exist between other resource protection requirements and the Coastal Act is something that Coastal Commission staff will be utilizing and refining as we move forward. The third key component for success was an upfront investment of time and resources. Multi-agency alignment and programmatic authorizations are very time intensive, but they pay dividends after plans are approved. Unfortunately, we are at the Coastal Commission almost always fully occupied with statutory deadlines for development projects, and we're typically unable to carry out this kind of upfront investment for restoration projects, but we are working really hard to focus our resources on advancing restoration. So looking to the future, these public works plans and the cutting green tape approach provide a model that can be repeated for both forest health and other types of restoration throughout the coast. And Commission staff are actively working to focus our resources on these efforts. The Coastal Act includes special protections for the coast, and advancing restoration helps carry out these special protections. So we aim to participate more often and early on in the process of project development and design so that we can ensure any specific Coastal Act requirements are addressed early on and incorporated into the project design rather than being need to be added at the end. So right now we're also working on another forest health plan for Monterey County, which will address challenging issues around chaparral restoration, as well as a programmatic approval for CDFW's fisheries restoration grant program up on the North Coast. We're also actively engaging in early planning efforts supporting coastal wetland restoration through the Southern California Wetlands Recovery Project, interagency review teams for mitigation banks, and other multi-agency groups statewide. So in closing, I would just say that this series of public works plans that we've done shows that what we can do when we work together towards a common goal and with a sense of urgency. And with additional staff capacity, the Coastal Commission can build on this momentum to further carry out the cutting green tape recommendations, developing more programmatic approvals and advancing restoration along the coast. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Madeline. What a great update. So much happening in a lot of really important transformational ways. You're thinking about new models and new pathways and thinking about the staff capacity to do that while building off of some of your existing expertise and efforts. So it really is great to have this update. And thank you so much for joining us again today with all that's happened since last September. Phil, we'll turn to you next. And my recollection is that Phil joined us last September and shared a little bit of an overview of what's happening with some of the State Water Resources Control Board efforts. And so Phil, want to just invite you back to the stage and hear what you've been doing since September, and excited to get an update.
Thanks, Sean. Good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you, and it's a pleasure to be here today. I'm Phil Crater. I am the Assistant Deputy Director of the Division of Water Quality with the State Water Resources Control Board, and I'm here today to talk about State Water Board programmatic permitting for restoration projects. For those of you who have worked in this realm for a while, you're probably well aware we have a small habitat restoration programmatic permit that we've used for some time. It's for habitat restoration projects that don't exceed 5 acres or 500 linear feet of stream bank, and that qualify for a categorical exemption for restoration projects under CEQA. So this is pretty narrowly focused and limiting, but it was intentional. It was a pilot project to make sure that this type of programmatic process would work well to streamline restoration and also address impacts to water quality. So acknowledging that this process has been working well for a number of years, how do we do more? You know, what can we do? Well, for years, we've recognized the need for a similar permit that would allow for expedited review of larger restoration projects, but we've always lacked the resources to develop a supporting CEQA document. And a few years ago, Sustainable Conservation offered to provide support to prepare an environmental document, and we're really grateful for that help. So the purpose of this permit is to provide authorization for qualifying restoration projects that don't qualify under the existing permit because they're too big. And it's not going to replace the existing permit. It's going to pick up where that permit left off. This permit will serve as both federal and state water quality permits in one for eligible restoration project types. And it's going to cover the whole state of California without any size limitations. So it really builds off the best qualities of this small permit and scales them out to bigger projects that might occur throughout the state. In order to qualify for coverage, we're proposing that a project will need to meet the definition of a restoration project and that it will comply with applicable state and regional water board basin plans, which are kind of the overarching rules for areas. So a restoration project in our proposed order is going to be defined as one that would result in a net increase in aquatic or riparian resource area functions and or services through implementation of the eligible project types, relevant general protection measures, which are like mitigation measures, and consideration of design guidelines, which are described in more detail in the draft permit. There's a whole group of projects that we envision might qualify for these, including improvements to stream crossings and fish passage, removal of small dams, tide gates, floodgates, and legacy structures, bioengineered bank stabilization, restoration, and enhancement of off-channel and side-channel habitat, water conservation projects, floodplain restoration, removal of pilings or other in-water structures, removal of non-native terrestrial and aquatic species, invasive species, and revegetation with native plants, establishment, restoration, and enhancement of tidal, subtidal, and freshwater wetlands, and of stream and riparian watershed sites. So the proposed permit has the potential to cover a much broader suite of activities, and again, without any size limitations. It's intended to streamline permitting by helping our staff provide applicants with an answer more quickly. And that could be a yes or a no. We all want to permit these qualifying restoration projects, including those that have multiple benefits, as quickly as possible. But we also acknowledge that not all projects are going to fit within the proposed order, and that's okay. There's a lot more work to be done in this area, and we're getting the supportive nudges that we need from the administration, from our executive management, our board, and from all of you to do the work. So we're really excited. Where are we at on the current project? Our documents were made available June 30th of 2021. The review and comment period closed August 13th of 2021. We're reviewing the comments that we received to determine where we might recommend changes in the draft. We're working to finalize these documents with our regional boards and with all of you, and planning to bring it to our board for consideration of adoption later this summer or perhaps in the early fall. If you haven't already taken a look at the proposed order, it's on our website, and I'd be happy to share a link if you can't find it. I also just want to give a big thanks to the folks that have been helping us on this. So in addition to my early acknowledgement for sustainable conservation, we've had invaluable support from our 9 regional water quality control boards, our partners at the Resources Agency, including Department of Fish and Wildlife and Department of Water Resources, and everybody here in the room. Last, in terms of looking forward into other activities, I wanted to preview for you that in addition to a framework for programmatic permitting of restoration activities. We're also getting very involved in programmatic permitting in forest health, wildfire resilience, and post-fire restoration. And it's all consistent with the Cutting the Green Tape initiative. And so we've got a lot more information about those activities on our website, and I can provide an update at a future event if there's an interest, including some of the programmatic permits that we're working on in that fire and forest health venue. So that concludes my quick update today. I really appreciate everybody listening, and I'm happy to answer questions through the chat or however Sean prefers.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Phil, and really appreciate how much information you packed into such a short presentation. Both you and Madeline here have really demonstrated the effectiveness of these lightning talks. You're just in 5 minutes providing such rich content to us in such a short amount of time. So thank you for taking the time to reconnect with us today, to provide an update on everything that's happening, and to make yourself available for Q&A. And because we are tight on time today, I am going to suggest that people engage in that Q&A through either the chat or the Q&A function. So I'm seeing questions emerge in both places, honestly, Phil. So you might need to look in both, but I would just invite those that have questions or would like to follow up with Phil to leave a message in either the chat or the Q&A and continue the conversation there.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, and we know those were really brief, both for Phil and Madeline and for all of us listening. I think we all crave a little bit more. And our hope is that you do seek out additional conversation with both of them. Ton happening with the State Water Board, with the Commission, and obviously with the state agencies as well. So hopefully we planted some seeds and you'll continue to dig into these conversations more following today's exchange. We're going to move forward with our agenda, and we're going to try something entirely new. So in an effort to respond to your desire to bring more voices and examples into the room in a way that's focused and as engaging as possible, we're taking an approach that might look a little bit more like your nightly news program than a typical panel discussion on a Zoom call. We hope it's a way to bring diverse voices into the room, different perspectives and different efforts, while making the most of our shared time together. So like the segment before, we hope it leads to conversations and discussions that extend well beyond the time we have together. So with that, I want to introduce two segments. The first segment focuses really on cutting green tape efforts around the state that focus on interagency collaboration. And to help kick that off, I'm going to invite our stalwart investigative reporter, Kelix Nelson, to further introduce and set the stage for the vignettes you're about to see. Kelix, take it away.
Thank you, Sean. So one of the things that we've really heard from people is that from all of you in your when you've responded to surveys we've sent or what have you, is that you are interested in hearing about interagency coordination or interagency collaborative efforts. So we put together sort of a highlights reel for you of 3 interagency efforts from around the state that have different regions, different purpose, different function, different governance. The first is the San Francisco Bay Restoration Regulatory Integration Team, also called BRIT. This was formed to improve the permitting process for multi-benefit habitat restoration projects and associated flood management and public access infrastructure in San Francisco Bay and along the shoreline of the 9 Bay Area counties. It includes staff from the 6 state and federal regulatory agencies with jurisdiction over habitat restoration projects in the Bay. It began in 2019, where these 5 public entities collaborated to fund the agency staff who coordinate on permitting. And there's also a manager level group that meets to discuss policy related issues. And it reports to a regional agency that was created in state legislature to fund shoreline restoration projects in San Francisco Bay. And so our speaker on the highlights reel from that is Amy Hutzel from the Coastal Conservancy. And maybe we can play that now.
The BRIT team has created, a one-stop shop for these restoration projects and proponents. So, they're bringing their project in front of all 6 of the state and federal regulatory agencies. I was, kind of surprised to discover that, a given staff person at a given regulatory agency, they don't necessarily know what the rules and regulations of the other regulatory agencies are. Some of these are pretty big issues that go well beyond restoration of San Francisco Bay, and the managers who sit on this policy management team. It's a lot to be expecting of them to solve, what in some cases are somewhat intractable issues. The Policy Management Committee has looked through, the recommendations in Cutting Green Tape, and a lot of them overlap with the policy issues identified by the Policy Management Committee. And I think there is this hope / expectation that some of these issues, are well beyond what, one manager sitting on the Policy Management Committee can tackle, but we can contribute to, a statewide discussion. So we are closely tracking the amount of time it takes to move a project through the BRIT process and be permitted. And I would argue that we have made an improvement, based anecdotally on projects that the Conservancy has worked to move forward over the past decade. I think we're seeing an improvement with the BRIT in terms of the timeframes. And then the other performance measure we're really looking at is how many policy issues is the management committee addressing annually. Regulatory and resource agencies, they share the goals of the restoration practitioners. Many of these regulatory and resource agencies have plans or documents or reports with very similar goals and objectives. They want to see restoration of San Francisco Bay. It's a lot easier to work together to get to a permit that everyone's happy with if you're starting from a baseline of trusting each other. The individual members of the BRIT are thinking innovatively about their own agencies' laws and regulations and how they are applied. What I've learned is, I don't have the answers to solving this problem, and there's not like one thing that we can do to solve the situation. So I think it's what I've recognized is just we have to take multiple actions. So whether that's setting up these coordinated teams like the BRIT, whether it's getting programmatic permits into place, whether it's working to change, fix, revise the existing rules and regulations. I mean, I think all these things need to be happening in parallel. We're all in the same boat together, and all trying to figure out how to navigate through the the laws, the regulations, the policies to get to, the best possible outcome for San Francisco Bay.
Thank you for showing that. The next highlight reel that we're going to show is from the Integrated Watershed Restoration Program, or IWRP, of the Central Coast, not to be confused with the state's Integrated Regional Water Management Program. So IWRP is a 17-year-old partnership of 3 Central Coast RCDs, San Mateo, Santa Cruz, and Monterey, with the California Coastal Conservancy and a technical advisory committee that includes local, state, and federal resource agencies and Indigenous groups. This is an informal collaboration. There's no MOU, there's no dedicated funding, and its purpose is to identify, develop, and advance high priority conservation projects. It's interesting in that it's the outcomes are emergent and the priorities are iterative. So we are going to watch a video now with the highlights with Jim Robbins, who serves as the TAC, or Technical Advisory Committee coordinator for the IWRP program.
IWRP wasn't developed explicitly to cut green tape. IWRP was developed specifically and explicitly to develop and implement really good high priority conservation projects in a collaborative way. So the goal was getting really good, really important projects done. Now, an outcome of that was a lot of cutting green tape. The IWRP TAC identified the need for NOAA fisheries to develop a programmatic biological opinion to help advance all the projects that were happening through IWRP, all the stream restoration and salmon restoration projects. That project, the first programmatic BO, was developed with input from the IWRP TAC and sort of birthed during discussions with the TAC in 2006. That programmatic biological opinion is sort of the template that has been used by NOAA in other regions throughout California to develop similar programmatic biological opinions, again, to cover salmon restoration projects, and is also a template for many of the other programmatic efforts going on statewide. In addition, the IWRP TAC identified the opportunity of developing consistency with the Coastal Act through the federal biological opinion that they held. It's not just about projects, it's about process. This is true of cutting green tape. It's true about restoration. It's true about conservation. It's about human beings. It's about us working together and figuring out the best ways to be efficient, support each other, listen to each other, and integrate each other's concerns and interests into projects and opportunities and move them forward. Nearly every construction project has short-term impacts. An old adage is you have to break some eggs to make an omelet. I heard that from a manager at the Department of Fish and Wildlife a number of years ago, and it's always resonated with me. And when we can kind of step back and focus as a group on all of the benefits, it's a little easier for us to be comfortable understanding and minimizing the risks associated with the temporary impacts. And a lot of the permitting we do for restoration projects is really focused on temporary construction related impacts. And so being able to address that in a collaborative way is a huge lesson learned. Yeah, well, I think if there's one thing we know, it's that IWRP's not perfect, and no collaboration is, because it's full of individuals and none of us are perfect. I think figuring out how to solicit a wider range of private and public folks, tribes, et cetera, that's something IWRP's trying to do so that we really get the best opportunities and figure out how to move them forward. It takes a commitment to the program and to process. Good conservation doesn't come out of the ether. It's a ton of hard work. It's lots of work with landowners. It's work with local agencies. It's work with the technical advisors. It's a lot of work across the board to hear people, understand people, and really move a program forward. Once the program is working, great. Program, it needs to be maintained, but it takes a lot of upfront work and a lot of personal touch. One of the sort of major trade-offs that we've been wrestling with is the success of IWORK and having a really large engaged TAC that at times for various meetings and field visits is 40 plus people, with the intimacy of a technical advisory committee that is small, where people feel really comfortable working together and have a lot of trust. And it's a constant tension that we are kind of trying to work through, is how to best manage engaging a large group of really interested people with the need for an intimate setting where people can really feel safe bouncing ideas off of each other, compromising, talking things through, challenging each other. There's no silver bullet answer, but it is a tension and a trade-off that we've been wrestling with, trying to figure out the best way to thread that needle. IWORK was built on the idea that projects would be better, would be more efficient, be more cost efficient if they were developed in lockstep as a collaboration with our resource agency partners, local, state, and federal.
Great, thank you, Sean. And then the last one that we're going to show today is from the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency's Environmental Improvement Program. This is a 25-year-old bi-state collaborative accomplishing landscape scale restoration that includes public agencies, private entities, scientists, and the Washoe tribe collaborating to implement the regional plan that they developed. And then recently, while that is a very established entity, more recently, they've had this big focus on efficiency of environmental restoration efforts. They have their own cutting green tape effort that they're moving forward, in which they're using as a case study a recently completed wetlands restoration project. And they're going back and looking at what are all the ways they could have done that better or differently and found more efficiencies with their own processes. And so our speaker on this highlight reel is Kimberly Carringer with the Tahoe Regional Planning Agency's Environmental Improvement Program.
Tahoe Regional Planning Agency is one of the few bi-state compact agencies in the country that really work across state lines to further the environmental goals and protections of our region. And we really serve as a leader, a collaborator, a convener, and a backbone of the Environmental Improvement Program. We really like to serve that convening role to pull all of these entities together to move them into the implementation of the regional plan through a really collaborative way. It's the way that we get the biggest collective impact in the region together. We all work together under one umbrella called the Environmental Improvement Program. We have 80 different partners across 2 states, 5 different counties working together to achieve all of our environmental goals of the region. And that includes improving the health of our forests, improving our water quality, our watershed health, improving our sustainable recreation opportunities in our transportation systems, our science, stewardship, and accountability for the whole program. So we work together in a lot of ways. Really, collaboration is in our DNA. You know, our origin story really came through a time of crisis when we really were faced with potentially losing the lake and lake clarity. And we all found that we had to work together across states, across jurisdictions, to all work together to improve the environment here. And again, in 2008, the Angora fire came to Lake Tahoe, and it was a small fire compared to the fires we have today. It was about 3,000 acres, but at that time, it was a wake-up call to the basin, and we formed the Tahoe Fire and Fuels Team, which is 21 different entities around the basin that all help with forest health and fire management. And they all came together, produced a blue ribbon report with tons of recommendations on how we could improve our processes and interagency coordination, permitting, lots of green tape process recommendations in there. And we, over the last decade, have implemented hundreds of them. And just last month, we implemented one of the final recommendations that came out of that report, and that was to modify a TRPA regulation that prohibited the use of mechanical equipment on slopes above 30%. And that protection regulation was put in place many years ago to protect water quality in the Tahoe Basin. but through a really robust scientific review, we found that we could modify that regulation to allow mechanical equipment above 30% slope because there's new equipment now. It's much more innovative, much lighter touch than it was 20 years ago. So it was time to review that regulation, modify it, and really it makes more sense now because we can implement the projects that we need and ensure the environmental protections that were intended by that regulation. So the Lake Tahoe Basin really was an early adopter of landscape scale collaboration and really even thinking ahead on these cutting the green tape elements because we have so many agencies and entities working together with different layers on their roles and their regulations and how we implement projects. We've been thinking about it for a while on how we make sure we all work together in the most efficient way to make the greatest impact. And now with the Cutting the Green Tape initiative that's started here, we really have decided to take one big project example and take the time to step back and look at what all actually went into it when we all put together our collaborative approach. And we looked and we worked through those steps, all of the environmental review, all of the environmental permitting, getting the funding to the table, breaking ground on the project. It's rare that we actually get time to take a step back and look at everything that we did and say, is there a way we can improve any of this from what we've already done?
Well, very cool. Kellex, you did some great investigative reporting. Thank you so much for reaching out to those folks and bringing them into the room with us. If folks want to ask questions of any of those people, I know that Jim and Kim and Amy were all online earlier today, and I'm sure would be happy to answer questions in the Q&A box. But because we've got Kellex here, who was doing the outreach and engaged all these different examples, I'm struck by a couple of things, Kellex. First, really great stories, but very different stories, very different examples from different places. I'm wondering what made those three examples stand out for you? Were you seeing particular similarities or differences that you wanted to explain to us?
Yeah, I was certainly interested in talking to different types of collaboratives in different regions to try to bring information forward to people who've been asking for it. They're in different regions. They had different genesis stories, whether it was responding to a crisis or a need to coordinate on priorities or a need to better permit. They had different genesis stories and they have different purposes. Is it a one-stop shop for permitting, or is it engaging agency staff from like soup to nuts for developing and advancing projects? Are they more formal, like it was an MOU and created in statute with dedicated funding, or are they informal? But what I found was that there were some themes running through them. One is that a lot of these collaboratives that we're seeing are really regional in nature. They're landscape scale, regional. That seems to be very right fitting for finding these landscape scale solutions. All of them talked about how relationships are an essential ingredient, relationships and trust. And many of them talked in different ways about how that's difficult to fund, but that's an essential ingredient. And they all have elements of both coordination and collaboration, but are kind of on different, maybe on different ends of the spectrum on what they focus on regarding what their intention was. And there are other groups, around the state. We're going to be doing more of this work to understand that, what are some of the irreducible elements of effective interagency collaboration, and, are they ones that are created for the purpose of cutting green tape, or did cutting green tape emerge out of them? But we're still seeing that as an important theme in getting their work done.
Great. Thanks so much, Kellex. It's a lot to distill and think about, and it's helpful to have someone like you go through and help point us towards some of those ideas that you were seeing, some of those threads that you saw that were common across the different elements, and just recognizing that there's not one size that fits all, right? That these look different in different places of the state. And it brings me back to something Secretary Crowfoot said at the beginning, which is so much of Cutting Green Tape is about empowering people who are closest to the projects and helping provide them with the information, the tools and resources that they need to be successful based on that local place-based context and the partners and relationships that they've developed.
Exactly.
Wonderful. So let's keep moving through here. We've got a couple more to share in our next segment. We're actually going to highlight another theme that has come forward from all of you, which is really looking at the intersection of Indigenous stewardship and Cutting Green Tape. And again, we've been lucky to have Kellex as our stalwart reporter go out and find a couple of examples to share with us from surveys, from conversations, from other feedback. This is something that is a theme that has emerged. And so we're glad to at least start the conversation today. In this next segment, we have 2 videos to share that pull out some key highlights of longer conversations we've held with a couple of people who are working in this space of Indigenous stewardship. The first is I'm sorry, I'm going to get the name wrong here if I don't look at my notes. Victor Belayets, I'm sorry, who is the superintendent of the California State Parks North Coast Redwoods. Victor, I'm so sorry I murdered your name there. I know you personally, and I feel embarrassed that I had to go look back up some notes that were on a different piece of paper. But anyway, Victor's been working to improve processes and remove barriers to contemporary Indigenous cultural practice, resulting in restoration or in restoring the jump dance ceremony that hadn't happened since it was banned by the US government way back in the 1800s. He's also established a joint powers authority that gives the Yurok tribe the authority to operate a state parks visitor center. He's been involved in changing hiring practices so that Yurok individuals could be the interpreters telling their own stories. And he's also been involved in an effort to rename a park to its traditional Indigenous name. So excited to hear from Victor here in a second by video. The second video we'll hear today highlights the work of Don Hankins, who many of you may know. He's an expert on Indigenous fire. He's a professor at California State University, Chico, and a Plains Miwok cultural practitioner. Don helped form the Intertribal Indigenous Stewardship Project and has been working with the state on incorporating cultural burns into state fire management plans. So let's go to the videos now. Let's start with the first one with Victor.
Think of somebody saying, hey, I want to have a party and I want to bring vehicles and I want to have a barbecue and we want to sleep over and we're going to be, doing this thing 24 hours a day. There will be people up and doing stuff. We want to have an insensitive ESHA and we want to do it during plover breeding season. And so we as good bureaucrats say, well, you have to watch out for this species and this is how you're going to protect it. If you bring a vehicle out there, you keep it on the wave slope and you put all of these restrictions. And then it comes down to a point where you're, it's almost putting pin flags of where folks can walk. And then while you're having this high ceremony, you'll have state park personnel that are out there saying, don't walk here, don't do this, don't do that. That was the environment that families first brought. They were trying to renew the practice of jump dance on the coast that they were faced with. What they were faced with was bureaucrats with a lot of no's and a lot of can'ts and a lot of won'ts. So we have to do a coastal development permit to do this because that's the kind of stuff we do. We have to get encroachment permits for Highway 101. Part of the ceremony, it goes across the Stone Lagoon on water, and then it goes up the hill and it crosses a road in the process. To put that on families that aren't involved with government is, it's tough. And a lot of times when we think of protecting resources, we talk about restricting access and restricting human access to areas so that they don't impact areas. What is the irony of this is that we're trying to protect these areas. And when we're doing a lot of restoration work, we're trying to get these forests and lands back into a condition that people had at the time of contact when Europeans came here. What we don't acknowledge is that it's a 10,000 year managed landscape. It was managed with fire, and it was managed with collection and harvest and lots of other means. So we're really trying to get back to a state at time of contact. And then we put restrictions and manage our lands that we manage as if the original stewards were going to harm them. As recently as 4 years ago, where you had an auntie who had medicine that she gathered. It was in a basket. She walked it out to a main trail and forgot her clippers, was going back to get her clippers, and came back, and there was a state park person in uniform that had emptied their basket and started talking about public resource code and how they weren't allowed to do what they're doing. So that's where that permit process and educating all the staff in this district that you're going to see Indigenous people, they're going to be doing things that they've done for thousands of years, and we support that. Where this contemporary ceremony was practiced out at Chopek at Stone Lagoon, it's protected by National Register designation. You know what it's the National Register designation is for? It's for the archaeological site. There is also a designation that you can go for National Register that talks about contemporary cultural practices and the spiritual significance of an area. We're going to be redoing, and this is something where we're working with Yurok tribe on redoing the National Register for this special site. So that's where, you know, well-meaning bureaucrats, without being embedded in the worldview, went for one of those mechanisms we have for protecting areas. And through that mechanism, we were then pointing at that protection of cultural resources when we're telling the very people whose people deposited those resources on the site, we're telling them what they need to do to protect that land for their ancestors. We were able to remove monuments to racist. We were able to remove names associated with parks for people that practice genocide. And it was something that the process that we used did not change. There's no new process, no new laws, no new policies or procedures. We use the mechanisms that have been in place for decades. And then what it takes is, and this sounds, you know, big because it is a paradigm shift. And so if you're always looking for you think that you're protecting your lands as a bureaucrat, as a district superintendent, as a park ranger, as a facilities person, as an environmental scientist, or an archaeologist or an anthropologist, if your mindset and your paradigm that you operate under is, I protect by limiting access, and then you have a shift of that thinking saying, here's a group that manage these lands to successfully manage these lands for thousands of years. How do I make them feel welcome? How do I, this is me, the bureaucrat, how do I create pathways to allow them to develop contemporary ceremony, to practice contemporary ceremony? And what are some of those bumps, or what are some of those restrictions that you find? When Governor Newsom apologized to Indigenous people, when he had an executive order saying, and then policy following, saying that you will give Indigenous people access, it was a challenge to everybody that's in state government in California to look for ways of giving access as opposed to denying access.
Wonderful. Thanks so much for that video, Kellex, and bringing us Victor's voice and story into the conversation. So Victor Belayets, now I've got that correct pronunciation in front of me. I think we can just move right into the next video. So next, again, we're going to hear from Don Hankins.
I'm Miwok from the Delta area. Miwok is our language, and I'm actually a speaker of the language. I started learning that in my early adult life. And so I spent a lot of time on the land, and, you know, growing up, I was always told of who my people are, and, you know, that kind of sense of thing. And I also always had a very strong connection to the environment. So, my grandparents growing up on my dad's side, who aren't Miwok, but tribal from elsewhere in the U.S., had spent a lot of time with me, taking me out to places along the San Mateo coast where my grandfather used to fish and, collect abalone and things like that with them. Is that prescribed fire is typically done for the main purposes of hazard fuel reduction and or wildlife habitat improvement. And cultural burning is done for a huge diversity of different reasons, everything ranging from spiritual to very specific resource objectives, like trying to increase grass production for seeds or culms for basket plants, or to improve the quality of those plants. And so there's very specific objectives that come from it. There's also traditional law that's attached to it, and I like to talk about how Indigenous communities have traditional stories that tell us about our responsibilities for the use of fire, and those conflict currently with the way that we have to regulate or be regulated around the use of fire, and the way that the laws are written in the state really kind of flies against what the law of the land is, which is that fire is here and that we as people have the ability to steward it. For Indigenous fire, a lot of times you see, I often use the analogy of like you're reading the landscape, like you see the needs of the landscape and it's communicating to you that this needs to happen. So, for instance, as I look out at a place, I see certain accumulations of fuel. I see certain plants looking diseased, or they're dying, or they look unwell. And those would be indicators that that place maybe needs to have some fire put to it. And, then I start thinking, okay, well, when seasonally is it appropriate? And that requires me to know the ecology of all the different plants and animals and whatnot that are found in those places, or at least the vast majority of that knowledge of those things. And then, picking the right conditions to get the objectives met that I want. So one thing I'll add about cultural burning or Indigenous, fire versus prescribed fire is that, Indigenous fire, and this is not my terminology, I've heard others say it, but Indigenous fire will always achieve the objectives of a prescribed fire, but a prescribed fire won't always achieve the objectives of a cultural fire. If we follow the guidance of the Western Regional Air Partnership, for instance, in their recommendations, they say that Indigenous cultural practices or Native American burning practices for both ceremonial and other purposes shouldn't be regulated. But within the state of California, for instance, at present we have policies that regulate smoke from prescribed and or cultural fire, and different air districts may treat it a little bit differently, but you have to know that. You have to build the rapport with the agencies to know what they are willing to allow you to do or whatnot. And again, like burning is the law of the land, like this land will burn. So being able to navigate that is really important. And then also, do you need a permit from CAL FIRE, or do you need to have somebody else come out and sanction that it's okay for you to burn for like wildlife concerns or whatever it is, right? Like there's just a lot of complexities and gray areas, and there's conflicting policies that exist in terms of like one agency's policies may allow you to do something and another agency's policies won't allow you to do something, and how do you navigate around that? The state obviously allows for agricultural burning to occur in these different air districts, and so is a cultural burn or a prescribed burn part of that, or is it something else? And so there's been a lot of outreach and education that's going on, a lot of discussion in different places. And in some places, the air districts have recognized things like what cultural burning is and exempt it. So they kind of take that approach of thinking of the guidance from the Western Regional Air Partnership, and other districts don't do that because they see that if they were to give preference or special exemptions for Indigenous burning, for instance, that it would be preferential treatment that would be to one group. Yeah, some of the successes that we've had over the past year in particular include the passage of two key pieces of legislation around prescribed and cultural burning. One of them is SB 332, which addresses liability constraints for prescribed burners and cultural burners, and actually defines what cultural burning is. And then the other is AB 642, which deals with a lot of different aspects of kind of the implementation of cultural burning and prescribed burning. It does a lot of other things within that piece of legislation, but it also codifies what a cultural burner is and what cultural fire is, which I think is a pretty forward-thinking piece of legislation. Aside from that, there are other successes, and like there's a lot of progressive actions that are taking place within the state right now around wildfire and forest resiliency, and thinking about being a member of the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Task Force. That we have the Wildfire and Forest Resilience Action Plan that the governor released in January of 2021. We have forthcoming I'm not exactly sure of the title of it because it keeps changing, but I want to call it the Beneficial Use Fire Strategic Plan, that is part of the implementation of prescribed and cultural burning in that. And those documents both outline opportunities for, one, advancing the amount of fire across the state, trying to reduce some of the barriers, and then also outlines the need to work with tribal communities.
All right, well, welcome back, guys. Really appreciate Jen's comment in the chat, because that's exactly what I was thinking, that I'm really loving to hear these perspectives. Lots of valuable information there. Just got a note from Kelix too, that there was so much additional conversation that unfortunately she cut out of these highlights reels, and it makes me think that we're just scratching the surface of a really important conversation. I'm super interested in hearing more from Don, for example, on this issue of prescribed and cultural fires and how that might progress moving forward. But really grateful to have at least this introduction to topics of concern, of interest around Indigenous stewardship and on the intergovernmental collaboration efforts moving forward. Also want to just appreciate all the work that went into those videos. So Kelix, thanks for reaching out to people, gathering really great stories, really interesting nuggets of information. I'm excited to hear more moving forward. Looks like you're on the screen again. This time you don't look like the same person. This time you look more like the executive director of the San Mateo RCD. So welcome. Also want to welcome Jen back to the screen, Jen Norris. And what we're going to move into next is our inaugural award ceremony for a brand new award, the Cutting Green Tape Hidden Hero Award. And I'm going to turn it over to both of you. I think Kelix, you're going to start.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, we're going to introduce the first Cutting Green Tape Hidden Hero Award. We're very excited about it, and I would like to ask our recipients to join the screen. So if we can bring Randy Adair with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife onto the screen, and Phil Crater from the State Water Resources Control Board. We have a few words for you. And if we can spotlight them. There you are, Randy. I wish this was in person. I could give you guys a big hug. I will read to you what it'll say on the certificate that you'll receive. The Cutting Green Tape Hidden Hero Award recognizes the innovation and dedication of public employees who are increasing the pace and scale of environmental stewardship in California. These hidden heroes are working with creativity and commitment to improve governmental processes so that we can implement California's natural resource goals and plans more efficiently and cost effectively, and with fidelity to California's environmental protection standards. So Jen has the certificate. I have these beautiful etched glass awards. And I'm personally delighted to present these inaugural awards to Randy Adair from the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, And Phil Crater with State Water Resources Control Board. I just want to know, that we see you, we see your work, we see your contributions, and we're so grateful for your tremendous efforts. And Jen, I didn't know if you wanted to say anything as well.
I just want to say, can you hear me? I took my earphones out. I said in the beginning, and I'll say this again, the rules, changing them, that's all great, but you got to have the right people in the right place that are willing to roll up their sleeves, take chances, think creatively, and really work on, I think, the essential element, which you mentioned earlier, Kellex, which is building trust and building relationships. And I know that, both of you are really moving forward in this, leaning in and working to be problem solvers. And that just makes such a difference. It makes people excited to work with the government as opposed to frustrated. And so I hope, we could have picked a lot of people, but you two really rose to the top. And I just want to say thank you for your efforts. And I also want to say from the secretary, he was super pumped to sign these awards. And they're signed not just by Wade, they're signed by Karen Ross and Joaquin Escobar and Kellex. So everybody's got a wet signature. They were all really excited about the awards and really proud of the work you do. So thank you both.
I don't know if either of you have any thoughts or comments or reflections while I put you on the spot, and it's okay if you don't want to, but just wanted to give you a moment.
I just wanted to say, what an honor this is. After hearing so many inspiring stories today, it really feels more like less like an individual accomplishment and more of a collective one. I personally work with so many hidden heroes every day. All the restoration practitioners on this call, and I have a huge number of support staff in my own organization that make our work possible. So I'm thrilled to be a recipient of today's award, but in accepting, I also want to recognize the extensive circle of people who I rely on in my daily work. So thank you everyone for your community, your support, and the inspiration that you provide.
Thanks everybody. This is a huge honor to accept this award, and it's really neat to be getting an award for something that I love to do. Is my favorite part of my job is working on the restoration and the programmatic permitting, cutting green tape. So it's, in that sense, it's been easy for me to do because it's enjoyable. And really what makes it wonderful is all the people that I'm working with that are also leaning into this and trying to make it happen. Bless you, Kellex. So I also just want to acknowledge the teammates in the state and the regional water boards and sustainable conservation and ESA and California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and all of you who are here taking time out of your day to listen to us and to come up with your ideas for how we can advance restoration in California. This is awesome, and I'm just looking forward to more shared successes with everybody here, and really appreciate everybody's support.
Well, I'm really glad to see you guys today. Again, I wish it could have been in person next time. Next time, perhaps we'll involve a fermented beverage as well. And until then, we will pass it back to you, Sean.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, guys, and congratulations, Randy and Phil. Just really cool to see that. Makes me reflect on all the work that everyone is doing to be a part of this process. And it's funny, we talk so much about the issues, the themes, the concerns, the challenges that we face, that it really is you all as individuals and collectively coming together to understand, to address, resolve, make progress. And so really, really just cool to see a couple of those people be honored today with our first Hidden Hero Award. And Randy, I thought you said it well, that it's really a community effort here, and so glad to be a part of this community as it continues to think about how to be part of the solutions that we're all seeking together. We are rapidly moving towards the end of our agenda and our exchange for today. So I want to invite Jen Norris back to join me here in this closing segment. And our job is simply to reflect back on a couple of the high-level themes or takeaways that we had listening to the exchange, all the information that was provided by our speakers, by those who were recorded ahead of time, by all the rich content that came forward in the chat, and just looking at the chat now, seeing a ton of congratulations and shout outs for Phil and Randy. So want to make sure you saw all those as well. And then we'll just share a couple of next steps, and then we'll get on with the rest of your day. So Jen, is there anything that you wanted to just highlight or share here as we close out?
Yeah, thanks, Sean. And I think I want to start by saying thank you, and thank you to the network for keeping these exchanges going, and the conversation. It's so valuable. Some of you know that my other day job is that I lead California's 30 by 30 effort, the initiative to conserve 30% of our lands and coastal waters by 2030. And when I think about that project, I often think about, the work you do every day is sort of right here, right at your desk, and it's frustrating and sometimes it's joyful, but it's sort of the day-to-day grind. But if you sort of zoom out just a little bit, you can see yourself as part of a bigger story. And what I love about 30 by 30 is you actually can zoom out to the whole globe and think about all the countries all around the world that are trying to make that happen. Restoration is a key piece of that puzzle. And the work we're doing at Cutting Green Tape is really an essential element of that larger effort. So one, you're part of 30 by 30. But what these exchanges, I think, do as well is they show us, I don't like Wade's rocket metaphor. I want to use a river metaphor, right? So if you add a drop here and a drop there, it doesn't seem like a whole lot of water, but at some point you start to really get some flow, and it starts to really feel like a system and an ecosystem. And I feel like you have all created this ecosystem, this space for us to see the work we're doing every day as part of this larger, very important project of restoring California, and doing it in a way that is thoughtful and mindful of protecting the species we care about, but at the same time moving as quickly as we possibly can, because there's no time to waste. So thank you for this space and for this opportunity to get together, and I look forward to the next one. I want to thank everybody who participated in this. Such great perspectives. There's a lot more work to do, but our river is flowing for sure. So thank you.
Thank you, Jen. Really appreciate those words, and for offering an alternative metaphor for us. It seems to be resonating with some of the folks here online. Sarah Beasley just dropped a little water drop into the chat box. So I love that, Sarah, and thank you for picking up on that. That's really what stood out to me most today too, is that there's just so much activity happening, and we were able to call out a drop here and a drop there throughout the conversation today, but recognizing that we're all part of this broader effort, this flowing river through an ecosystem that we're creating that's continuing to evolve. And so thank you all for contributing to that and being part of the process. I want to just close by saying, if you haven't yet had a chance to look at the chat box, there's a ton of really important resources in there. We'll make sure to save that and send that out to everyone, including a new update report from California Natural Resources Agency. And so we wanted to just call that out. There's also an effort underway from the California Network to take a close look at the Cutting Green Tape initiative and develop a case study. So over the next 18 months, we're working with academic researchers, others, many of you have probably been invited to be part of that case study through an interview, just to learn more about how did this process unfold? What did we learn about it? How is it helping to inform efforts moving forward? So if we're going to do more complex work through these different diverse networks that we're creating, how can we create better pathways for the future for those that come after us? Also want to pick up additional threads, whether it's Indigenous stewardship or interagency collaboration, or the work of other people who are engaged in different places across the state. And so the network will continue to work with all of you to support and broaden efforts of Cutting Green Tape moving forward. We'll continue this series of exchanges too. I feel like we learn from each one about different content areas, different ways of engaging, different themes, different voices that we want to bring forward. And so looking ahead to fall 2022, we'll be looking back to all of you to continue this conversation and to continue to find ways to come together. We are also talking behind the screen before we jumped on today that with any luck, that can be in person, and we'll have a chance to spend some time getting to know each other a little bit more in a way that feels a little bit limited in this Zoom platform. But really delighted to have the time to spend with you all today. Thanks to everyone who contributed, who participated, who shared thoughts, resources, and otherwise just invite you to continue to be part of the conversation. And one way to do that is to take advantage of the link that was just dropped into the chat box, just a chance to share brief thoughts on how today went and what we might be thinking about as we move forward. and look towards October 2022 for our next exchange. For now, take care. Thank you so much, and we'll see you down the road. Bye-bye.